Thank you so much, Professor Friedman. I neglected to mention in my short introduction that Professor Friedman is the 1991 recipient of the Richard J. Dennis Drug Peace Award for outstanding achievement in the field of drug policy reform, which will be presented this evening at our awards banquet by the Drug Policy Foundation. I suggest you send your questions up, by the way. I have a few, and if you have questions, please send them up. You can bring them right over here to Kevin. I have a two-part question, one from the floor and one with a bit of my own amendment. I'm allowed to do that. Should every produced good be subject to the free market? And the second part of the question was, if I look back at Adam Smith, and once with great foreboding I read the book, I think Adam Smith accepted the idea of, as you say, a limited role for government, including the administration of justice, and I think the phrase was the common defense. Many drug warriors would claim that because of the unique nature of drugs, they fit properly within the administration of justice and the common defense.
On the first half of the question, I do not believe that all items of production ought to be subject. I believe there is a case for keeping out of the market certain things. I don't believe it's highly desirable to have a market in atomic bombs. But the number and the list of things for which you can really justify a prohibition is very limited. And the main argument in most of these cases is the only justification is always in terms of the existence of innocent victims. In the case of drugs, the major effect of drug prohibition is to multiply the number of innocent victims, not to reduce them. And that's why I don't think that any general rule you might have that there are some products which should not be traded in the market, such as atomic bombs, hydrogen bombs, and a few things like that, applies to the case of drugs. Now, on the second question, I don't believe if Adam Smith were here today, he would agree with that interpretation of his strictures. The reason why the prohibition of drugs is not a case of the administration of justice is because the drug user, whether he's smart or foolish or not, harms primarily himself. Now, there is a case for doing something in which the drug user harms other people, and we do. The case of alcohol is very simple. The person who drives when he's drunk, there is an argument, clearly should be prosecuted for that. It's the act of driving while drunk, not the act of drinking, for which he should be prosecuted. And similarly, if people under the influence of drugs do a similar thing, the act of doing that thing is what should be prosecuted, not the ingestion of the drugs. See, I think there are two arguments, as I've always argued, for drug prohibition. One is from principle, that people ought to be responsible for themselves, and the government has no business telling me what to ingest. This is, I'm sure, the argument I'm sure this is the argument you heard very effectively from Dr. Sauce. But there's also the question of expediency. The question, for a moment, waive the question of principle. Are you doing more harm than good? And there, the evidence seems to me so overwhelming that it appeals to people who will not join you on matters of principle. I give you some examples. My fundamental bias toward this initially developed out of the principle. My good friend Bill Buckley was initially in favor of drug prohibition. In fact, my son David once wrote an article attacking Bill's views on prohibition under the title, "Is Bill Buckley a Communicable Disease?" The reason being that Bill had argued in favor of drug prohibition on the ground that one drug user would communicate to another and infect him. And David said in his piece, well, Bill's ideas infect others. In fact, if you take that to an extreme case, I don't think this was his example, it's mine. Karl Marx's Capitalism and Freedom killed far more people. Karl Marx's, boy, what a Freudian slip. Karl Marx's Kapital surely has ended up killing more people than all the people that have ever been killed by alcohol, cigarettes, and tobacco and drugs combined. But our principles of free speech says people ought to be free to read it. And that was what he meant by his Bill Buckley communicable disease. Well, Bill has switched, and he is now a very strong proponent of drug legalization. Not on the grounds of principle, but on the grounds of expediency, on the ground that the effort has failed and ought to be terminated. It's done far more harm than good, and there is no way of modifying it to make it do good. So I don't believe there's any way in which you can say that the prohibition of drugs is administering justice. Justice to whom? Is it justice to the people in Colombia who are being murdered because we can't enforce our own laws? That's hardly justice.
I wasn't saying it. I was wondering if Adam Smith would. I know how you
No, I don't think Adam Smith would. Adam Smith was a very, very great man, a very smart man.
There's a series of questions here. I'm going to put them together. You supported Ronald Reagan.
Yes.
This says you supported Pinochet or advised Pinochet.
I never advised Pinochet. I never supported Pinochet.
We'll throw that one away.
But, hold on. No, I don't want to evade the question.
All right.
Chile was a case in which a military regime headed by Pinochet was willing to switch the organization of the economy from a top-down to a bottom-up performance. And in that process, a group of people who had been trained at the University of Chicago in the Department of Economics, who came to be called the Chicago Boys, played a major role in designing and implementing the economic reforms. The real miracle in Chile was not that those economic reforms worked so well. Chile is by all odds the best success story in Latin America today. The real miracle is not that those economic arrangements worked so well, because that's what Adam Smith said. The real miracle is that a military junta was willing to let them do it. See, as I said to begin with, the principles of the military is from the top down. The principle of a market is from the bottom up. Now, it's a real miracle that a military group was willing to let a bottom-up approach take over. And as you know, as I say, I did make a trip to Chile, and I made talks in Chile. In fact, I did meet with Mr. Pinochet, but I was never advised by him. I never got a penny from the Chilean government. I was never an advisor to him. But I will say that that process led to a situation in which you were able to get an election which ended the military junta, and you now have a democratic government. You cannot cite any similar example from the world of entirely socialist states. So I was not an advisor to Pinochet. I was not an advisor to the Chilean government, but I am more than willing to share in the credit for the extraordinary job that our students did down there.
Let me bring you back to Ronald Reagan. I believe you were a supporter of Ronald Reagan.
I still am.
And
but not of everything that he did.
Okay, that's the real question is, as I say, I was grouping these together. How do you feel about his drug war? I think I know the answer. We know that.
Oh, well, the answer is clear. I think his drug war was a mistake. And there are two areas in which I think he did very badly during his administration. One was a drug war, and one was foreign trade. In the case of foreign trade, he laid the groundwork, unfortunately, for what has become a protectionist drive and movement by agreeing to the so-called voluntary import quotas on Japanese cars. And that was an enormous mistake, went against all of his stated principles. On the other hand, as I once said to a Republican club of students at Stanford, I am a libertarian with a small l and a Republican with a capital R. And I am a Republican with a capital R on grounds of expediency, not on principle. And I think I can do more good by having influence within the Republicans than I can by joining the Libertarian Party. Although I have great sympathy with the Libertarian Party, I think it's very desirable that they do well. But in my personal case, my personal situation happened to be that I could be effective that way. And Ronald Reagan was a man of principle. He is the first president in my life who was elected because the people had come around to agreeing with him, rather than because he was looking at polls and saying what the people wanted to hear. He was saying exactly the same thing in 1980 when he was nominated as he was in 1964 when he supported Mr. Goldwater. What changed was not what he was saying, but what the public had come to believe. And his fundamental principle, that government was too big, that government was a problem, is correct. Unfortunately, the war on drugs was, in my opinion, inconsistent with that fundamental principle, and he should not have followed it. But I may say to you also that I would have no hesitancy to say that to Ronald Reagan, and have, and he is a man to whom you can. You know, people have a great misconception about Mr. Reagan. They think that somehow he only listens to what he wants to hear, but that's not true.
You are a very persuasive fellow, I'm told. Out of curiosity, when you said that to Ronald Reagan, can you tell us what he replied?
No, I did not say it to him in that connection, because he, I wasn't in Washington. I was in California, or California all the time. So I can't say that I said it to him in connection with the particular issues.
There are several questions along this line. In light of the objective standing of the U.S. below the EEC by every standard, that is the European countries, that measures quality of life and the reality that every EEC country is socialist, how can you argue for laissez-faire capitalism, or this says robber bandit free market capitalism as a path, you know, for
I understand. Well, I'm delighted to have some socialists in this organization.
We have a few.
Someone to convince, right?
Well, you know, I know when I talk to you about drug legalization, I'm talking to the converted. But when I'm talking to you about socialism, I'm not talking to the converted, so I'm being more useful. In the first place, I do not agree with the factual statement in that remark. I do not agree that the EEC countries organize a higher, better quality of life in general. The typical difference between the EEC countries and the United States is that the United States is a country of much greater diversity. And most of the EEC countries have relatively homogeneous populations. A country like Sweden, even a country like Britain, they have some immigrants, they have some outsiders, and in almost all cases those are a great cause of trouble. You won't find a Turk in Germany or a Moroccan in France who will subscribe to the view that life is better in the EEC countries than it is in the United States. While we in the United States have a much greater variety and have been much more open and welcome to people. But in the second place, when you come to measure socialism, there's very little more than a dime's worth of difference between the degree of socialism in those countries and in this. The major difference is that those countries, some of them, have more government-owned and operated enterprises. That's the major difference. Our only government-owned and enterprise, in one sense, is the post office. On the other hand, our government has operated and extended its influence in considerable measure, primarily by regulation and rules and restrictive arrangements, and in that case, far more so than most of the European countries. In an issue that's very closely related to the drug issue, our Food and Drug Administration is a much more restrictive and socialist enterprise than are their counterparts in England and other countries, as is evidenced by the drug lag. That is, in general, it takes a good deal longer to get a drug approved for use in the United States than it does in Britain or Canada or some of the or Germany. Indeed, that's another case in which what's intended to save people's lives is killing far more people than it is saving, namely our Food and Drug Administration, which I'm in favor of abolishing. But so I don't agree that those countries are very much more socialist. What I do think is a very different thing. And I'll go back to Adam Smith for this.
Good idea.
When Yorktown, when Cornwallis was defeated at Yorktown in the Revolutionary War, a young man came to Adam Smith and said that was going to be the ruination of Britain, of England. And Adam Smith said to him, "Young man," he said, "there's a deal of ruin in a nation." Now, what do I mean by that? I mean that we are, as I emphasized, we have a very high standard of living. We have the highest standard of living in reality of any country in the world. Not for the few, for the many, for the many. I beg your pardon. We have a more equal distribution of income in general than most of the countries you're talking about. The distribution of income. I'm sorry, I couldn't hear most of it.
Excuse me, would you mind sending your questions up? The mic isn't picking up. The mic isn't picking it up, so please cool it.
Well, somebody said, I'll say what it is. Somebody crowded out for the few, not for the many. It is true that there are a few who have enormously high incomes, too many of them. But the fact is that when I speak about the level of living, I am speaking about the level of living of the great majority of the people in the country. There's inequality of income in every country. Those inequalities are far greater, in point of fact, far greater in socialist countries than they are in capitalist countries. If you compare the level of living of people at the top and people at the bottom, the difference was much wider, for example, in pre-collapsed Soviet Union than it is in the United States. So the issue of distribution of income is a very serious and important issue, and it's worth discussing. I don't mean it isn't. But I think the statement I've made is correct for the great bulk of the American people. The evidence is very simple. How do people best vote? With their feet. Where do people try to immigrate? Some people do try to get into the European countries. In particular, the people from the former communist countries try to get into the less socialist countries of Western Europe. But so far as the United States is concerned, people from all over the world seek to emigrate here. They aren't coming here to be made miserable. They aren't coming here to be exploited. And you can't say that they're all fools. They know what they're getting into. So I reject the idea that this is a country in which a few stand on the backs of the multitudes, which is a standard argument of the Marxists.
Let me...
Well, I'm glad to see there are a few non-socialists here, too.
It's very clear, simply from the applause, that the Drug Policy Foundation attracts a very wide range of opinions on all matters of things.
And so you should.
Thank you. This may well be the last question, sir. And there have been several like this. Looking at the future, in a market of retail sales of re-legalized drugs, what do you think of the suggestions that have been made about how you model those reforms? For example, one of our board of directors members, Lester Grinspoon of Harvard, has suggested a harmfulness tax based upon the relative harmfulness of the drugs. Senator Gallagher of New York State Senate, who is here, put in a bill that would have treated all the illegal drugs, all of them, made them available legally, but would have regulated them like alcohol. They would use precisely the alcohol model. For example, you could get the drug if you were an adult. You couldn't have the retail store near a school, etc. What thoughts do you have on the future?
My own view is that I have no chance whatsoever in the near future or the distant future of getting what I would really like, which is a free market. And I have always argued that as a first step on the right road, I believe the right thing to do is to treat drugs, currently illegal drugs, exactly the same way you treat alcohol and tobacco. Not because that's the best way, not because that's the ideal arrangement, but because it's an arrangement that people know that is in existence. It involves, in a certain sense, the least kind of change. so that the law you've described by the New York
Senator Galver.
Senator Galver, it seems to me is the right direction in which to go.